I want to start the narrative with a number. 1816. When you heard the number, something probably came to mind immediately. The year Antarctica was discovered. That's how teachers told it. That's how textbooks wrote it. That's how timelines showed it. The year it was officially recorded for the first time, they say. The year it was first documented, first acknowledged. They add those words if you insist. And for most of my life, I accepted this as it was. I didn't question it. Why would I? It's the kind of knowledge you learn in school, the kind that settles into you without resistance, without asking why. They tell you, you take notes, you take the exam, you move on. Because I had no reason not to. But at some point, I started looking more carefully at dates. Not just at the years, but at the gaps between them. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop. In that video, I had examined 1816, that year which mainstream historians call the year without a summer. The official explanation goes like this. The Tambora volcano in Indonesia erupts. It hurls such a massive amount of ash and particles into the atmosphere that sunlight is blocked. Temperatures drop across the northern hemisphere. Harvests are destroyed. Animals perish. A wave of famine spreads from New England all the way to northern Europe. Snow falls in the middle of summer. Summer literally turns into winter. It all appears as a deeply strange situation. One volcano. All these consequences. The explanation looks tidy. The timeline is clean. The narrative sits neatly in place. But I started finding unexplained threads within that narrative. Here's the thing. What the official narrative cannot explain is the uniformity of this destruction. Crop failures weren't regional. They were global. Reports of snow in June, unusual sunsets in shades of orange and purple, unnaturally freezing cold, these weren't seen near Indonesia. They appeared simultaneously in vastly different regions. And the impact wasn't only environmental. Socially, politically, fractures occurred across very different regions as well. In the years immediately following 1816, institutions collapsed, communities were displaced, and what one researcher described as civilizational memory losses occurred. Communities that seemed to have forgotten what they had done before, that appeared to have severed their connection with what came before them. In that video, I proposed something unsettling, and I know it should be unsettling. Good. I said this. The atmospheric event of 1816 may not have been solely a volcanic eruption. Or more precisely, it may not have been only a volcanic eruption. I said that the atmospheric signature of that year more closely resembled a nuclear winter, a sudden, total atmospheric blackout that came not from a mountain, but from a civilization-ending event. A reset. The kind of event that left behind not just climate data, but an erasure of memory. And I connected this event to a global old-world civilization that left traces of its existence before the 19th century, interconnected across continents, architecturally advanced. The civilization we provisionally call Tartaria. Not an empire in the classical sense, not a country with borders on a modern map, something harder to define. A presence. A civilization that left fingerprints. Fingerprints you can see everywhere once you know what to look for, in the architecture, in the canal systems, in city plans that appear in the historical record fully built, without any construction documentation, without any scaffolding period, without the messy, incremental archaeology that human settlement requires. And then it vanished. As if it had never existed. We covered all of that. But there was one detail I kept returning to. A date I had set aside because it felt almost too convenient, too perfectly placed. The date Antarctica was discovered. 4 years after 1816. Hold that 4-year gap in your mind. Not a generation, not a century, just 4 years after the event claimed to be the largest atmospheric catastrophe ever recorded in human history. Yes, listen to this part carefully. If my previous analysis holds, 1816 functioned as the final act of a global civilizational collapse, an event where the entire world froze simultaneously. And then, for years later, the most remote, most inaccessible, most sealed, most frozen landmass in all of human history is suddenly, officially discovered. Doesn't that sound strange? And it wasn't done by a single crew. 3 crews. A British crew, an American crew, a Russian crew, said to be operating independently, in the same region, months apart from each other, all in 1820. I can't tell you that's impossible. Discoveries overlap. Competition accelerates exploration. Multiple parties can converge on the same target. I understand all of that. But I want to ask a different question. Not how, but why then? The Phoenicians sailed the open seas. The Greeks, Romans, Chinese, Arabs, every civilization in history that developed a maritime culture built ships, crossed oceans, mapped continents. Why did the largest landmass south of the equator escape the notice of all these thousands of years of advanced seafaring civilizations? And why, in exactly this 4-year window, did exactly these 3 crews find it at exactly the same time? No sufficient answer has been given to this question. No answer at all, really. Because this is where the official narrative starts developing serious cracks. When I dove into the cartographic record, and I mean deep, into archives not cited in introductory history courses, I noticed that the date 1820 began to look less like a beginning and more like a cover story. There are maps that show Antarctica long before 1820. Real, surviving, historically documented maps. This map, drawn by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, shows a landmass to the south. Not a vague blob. Not a speculative outline. A detailed, accurate coastline. And when 20th century researchers overlaid this coastline against modern satellite imagery, that is, against the actual rock beneath 2 miles of ice, the correspondence appeared with a precision that no one has been able to satisfactorily explain. Piri Reis also documented that he hadn't drawn the map from his own observations. He wrote that he compiled it from older source maps that were never named, whose locations are unknown, whose lineage has never been fully traced. This map goes even further. It shows Antarctica without ice, with river systems, with mountain ranges, with internal geographic features, and with details we were only able to technologically confirm through mid-20th century sonar technology. Let's stop for a moment and really think about this, because it's very easy to rush past, but we need to examine it carefully. A map drawn in 1531 shows geological features of Antarctica that humanity could only technologically verify in the 1950s. The Academy's official response was coincidence, a lucky guess, or the suggestion that ancient cartographers may have drawn an imaginary southern landmass for philosophical and geometric reasons, out of a notion of symmetry, a logic that the north must be balanced by a south. Maybe so. Maybe it really is coincidence. But how do you guess a river? How do you accurately draw mountain ranges beneath ice? How do you imagine a coastline that will match satellite data 500 years later? You don't guess that. You can't theorize your way to that. You can only draw it by being there, by observing it firsthand, or by learning from someone who was. And that raises a question the mainstream record has never satisfactorily answered. Who or what was there? I want to keep asking this question, because here is the core issue. The knowledge was preserved. In the Piri Reis map, the Admiral explicitly states he compiled it from older sources. Those sources were never named, never located, never fully traced. It means someone held this knowledge. A chain of hands preserved it across centuries, beyond the rupture of 1816, all the way to the point where 3 separate parties converged on the same place. an Ottoman admiral, a Nazi expedition, an American naval fleet. In 1938, Nazi Germany carried out its own Antarctic expedition, the Schwabenland expedition. Nearly 600,000 square kilometers was mapped. Thousands of marker stakes were planted to assert territorial claims. And it reportedly concluded with the kind of return where the official records are incomplete, the kind of incomplete that records tend to be when the answer matters. What, or who, did they find? We're not told. But what we do know is this: German submarines were documented in Antarctic waters as late as 1945. And the interest of certain high-ranking figures in the Nazi scientific apparatus and ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, and cartographic traditions said to predate the modern world, that is documented fact. The same maps, the same thread. In 1946, immediately following World War II, the U.S. Navy launched Operation High Jump. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, approximately 5,000 military personnel, under the command of Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. Official objective: scientific mapping, establishing a base. Maybe that was all it was. But the timing once again becomes impossible to set aside, because the Americans were not the first military power to take Antarctica seriously. Not even close. Same thread, same place, different centuries, different flags, same direction. They were all going there. So what did they find? And what are they not telling us? Now I want to talk about what we are not permitted to do, because this is the part that most of the Antarctica conversation skips over. And I think it's the most important part. You cannot freely go to Antarctica. When I say this, the standard response is, "Of course you can, expeditions go there all the time." Yes, that's true. There are scientific expeditions, government-sanctioned research missions, even tourism in limited and tightly supervised forms. I'm not saying there's an invisible wall around the continent. What I am saying is this: the Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959 and now ratified by over 50 nations, designates the continent as a scientific preserve and explicitly prohibits military activity, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing on the continent. And in practice, it means this: independent, unsupervised exploration of Antarctica's interior is virtually impossible. Not exactly illegal, just practically impossible. It requires logistical support that only governments and large institutions can provide. It requires permits that are quietly difficult to obtain for anything outside approved research parameters. The infrastructure for the independent traveler simply does not exist. The result: Antarctica is functionally the one place on Earth that a citizen of the 21st century simply cannot go and look around. And why do we find this normal? Every landmass on the planet, every mountain range, every forest, every desert is accessible to a motivated individual with sufficient resources and determination. People climb Everest recreationally. They cross the Sahara alone. They reach the most remote islands on Earth with nothing but a small boat and a compass. But Antarctica has a treaty. 50 nations signed it in the same decade that sonar technology first began confirming what lay beneath the ice. And we don't find this remarkable. We nod along. We accept that the treaty was made in the name of science, peace, environmental protection, because we hope that's what it was. Maybe it is. But the coordination problem becomes increasingly impossible to ignore the longer you sit with it. 50 nations cannot agree on almost anything. Borders, resources, ideology, language. The 20th century is practically a history of these disagreements. With one exception. On this frozen continent. About this. Why does an international treaty exist for ice and penguins? Now I want to talk about the architecture question, because this is where the Tartaria connection moves from abstract to concrete. throughout this entire series, imperfectly, provisionally, but document by document, I've been trying to show this. Across the world, in places the official record says were founded at the beginning of the 19th century, there are structures those settlements could not have possessed. Buildings that appear in the historical record fully constructed, all at once. No construction phases. No scaffolding period. None of the messy, incremental archaeology that human settlement requires. Cathedrals in frontier towns. Elaborate sewer systems in cities that were, according to the official record, untamed wilderness 5 years earlier. Systems that would have required decades and resources those young settlements simply didn't have. The mud flood evidence, buried ground floors, windows that now begin below street level, because the street level rose, or something was piled on top of what was already there. This pattern repeats in North America, in Europe, in Russia, in South America, not regional, not isolated, global. And every time we document it, the official explanation is either dismissal or a casual hand wave that begins to fall apart on contact with the actual evidence. Transition periods are missing. Documentation is thin. The workforce said to have built these structures is unaccounted for. Supply chains don't exist. Timelines don't hold. Someone was there before. Someone built all of this before. Or so the evidence seems to suggest. Now I return to Antarctica, because from the cartographic evidence, from the ice-free maps, from the subglacial topography, we know that Antarctica was, in historically recent time, a habitable landmass. Not geologically ancient, historically recent. Recent enough for humans to map it. Recent enough for those maps to survive through copy after copy into the 16th century. What was on that continent? What is, or what lies, beneath 2 kilometers of ice right now? I'm not saying there are pyramids beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, though some structures in the Ellsworth Mountains do have a geometry that has generated genuine academic debate. I'm not saying there is a lost city buried beneath an ice shelf. I'm asking something simpler and more important. Why don't we know? Why are they hiding it? Why in 2026, with ground-penetrating radar technology capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with satellite systems that can read a license plate from orbit, with the full weight of the most technologically advanced civilization ever recorded pointed at every corner of the Earth? Why is the subglacial topography of Antarctica's interior still largely unmapped at high resolution? Why do the data gaps cluster in the interior regions? Why does the silence persist? Why is it not allowed to be known? In this story, the silence is everywhere. You hear it when you listen for it. No serious mainstream academic discussion of the Piri Reis map in introductory curricula. It doesn't even rate a footnote. Usually it's not there at all. No institutional curiosity about the 3 simultaneous expeditions of 1820. Discoveries overlap. It's coincidence, we move on. No explanation whatsoever for the chasm between the ice-free maps of the 16th century and the frozen wasteland officially discovered in the 19th. Silence maintained across this many disciplines for this long, at this scale, that is not an absence of evidence. That is a shape. And that shape points towards something. I'm not going to tell you what. I think you already feel it. Let us accept, provisionally, carefully, with all appropriate skepticism. Before the 19th century, there existed a significantly advanced, globally connected civilization. That civilization left behind infrastructure, maps, architectural techniques, and knowledge that our official history cannot account for. The events of 1816 represented, in some form, the final convulsion of that civilization's collapse. A collapse so total, so sudden, that it left atmospheric scars visible across the northern hemisphere. And Antarctica, that last landmass shown ice-free, habitable, and mapped on the older charts, was in the years immediately following frozen over, treaty-locked, and quietly removed from public access. Then we are forced to ask the hardest question. What, or who, was being protected? Not necessarily from us. Perhaps from time. Perhaps from chaotic, uncoordinated, uncontrolled discovery. The kind of discovery that might happen if anyone with a ship and a sense of curiosity could sail down and start digging. What knowledge was stored there? What records? What architecture? What evidence of a civilization that would require us to rewrite the story we've been telling ourselves? I don't know. I say that honestly. I've been carrying these questions for months. Instead of resolving, they deepen. The further I go into the record, the more I find not answers, but structure. The shape of something deliberately concealed. Something whose outline I can trace without being able to see its face. Once you see that structure, you cannot look away. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816. For years later, 3 nations simultaneously discover the same continent. A century after that, 50 nations sign at the same time. What a coincidence. Ancient maps showing what lies beneath the ice. A historical record that falls silent at the very moments where continuity should exist. Architecture with no builders, cities with no origins. And a continent renamed, restricted, covered in ice, and quietly kept out of reach. Perhaps, at a depth of less than 3 kilometers, in frozen silence, the answers to all of this are waiting. Perhaps, perhaps not. But I can't get 1820 out of my head. And I don't think you will either. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. I think I'm ready now. See you there.